Judge Wilson took a deep breath and looked around the courtroom, which was still buzzing with quiet whispers and shocked expressions. She had handled thousands of cases during her career, but nothing quite like this. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, and she knew that whatever happened next would be remembered by everyone present for years to come. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying the authority that comes with years of maintaining order in chaotic situations. "I'm going to ask for complete silence while we finish these proceedings." The courtroom fell quiet immediately. Even the two small children who had been fidgeting earlier seemed to sense that something important was happening and sat perfectly still next to their mother. Judge Wilson turned her attention back to David, who remained seated calmly in the witness chair, showing no sign of smugness or superiority despite the dramatic turn of events. "Director Thompson, do you have anything else you'd like to add to your testimony?" David stood up slowly and looked around the courtroom, his eyes briefly meeting those of Officer Johnson and Officer Rodriguez, before settling back on the judge. "Your Honor, I want to make something very clear. I didn't reveal my position to intimidate anyone or to get special treatment. I revealed it because the truth matters, especially in a court of law." His voice was steady and measured, the same tone he might use when addressing Congress or briefing the president. "Every citizen, regardless of their job or background, deserves to be treated with respect and fairness during police encounters. What happened to me that morning could have happened to anyone, and that's what concerns me most." Officer Johnson was staring at the floor, his face red with shame and embarrassment. All morning, he had been so sure of himself, so confident that he had handled a difficult situation properly. Now he was realizing that his assumptions and prejudices had led him to treat one of the highest-ranking law enforcement officials in the country like a common criminal. David continued, "I want to commend Officer Johnson for his service and dedication to public safety. Police work is difficult and often thankless. However, this situation highlights the importance of treating every person with dignity and following proper procedures, regardless of who we think they are or what we assume about them." The grace and professionalism in David's words seemed to make Officer Johnson feel even worse. If David had been angry or demanding punishment, it might have been easier to handle. Instead, the FBI director was showing the kind of leadership and character that made Johnson realize how poorly he had conducted himself. Judge Wilson nodded approvingly. "Director Thompson, your conduct throughout this entire process has been exemplary. Based on the testimony I've heard today and the significant discrepancies between the police report and the facts as presented, I'm dismissing all charges against you." She turned to look directly at Officer Johnson. "However, I have serious concerns about the testimony given by Officer Johnson. The contradictions regarding the speed limit, the location description, and the characterization of the defendant's behavior suggest either poor observation skills or deliberate misrepresentation." Officer Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his seat, knowing that his earlier comments and assumptions were probably going to be part of whatever investigation followed this disaster. "Officer Johnson," Judge Wilson continued, "I'm ordering a complete review of this incident by your department's Internal Affairs Division. I'm also recommending additional training on constitutional rights, proper traffic stop procedures, and community relations." Johnson finally looked up, his eyes filled with regret. "Yes, Your Honor." "I understand." Prosecutor Williams stood up, clearly embarrassed by how the case had unfolded. "Your Honor, the state apologizes for bringing charges that were not supported by accurate evidence. We will be reviewing our procedures for case evaluation to prevent similar situations in the future." David stepped down from the witness stand and walked back toward his seat, but Judge Wilson called his name before he could sit down. "Director Thompson, do you have any recommendations for how we can prevent incidents like this from occurring in the future?" David paused and turned back toward the bench. "Your Honor, I believe this situation arose from assumptions based on appearance and preconceived notions about who belongs where. The best prevention is training that emphasizes treating every person with respect and professionalism, regardless of how they look or where they're found." He gestured slightly toward the officers. "I also believe in second chances and learning from mistakes. Officer Johnson made errors in judgment, but those errors can become valuable lessons for other officers. If we handle this situation constructively, the elderly woman in the front row was nodding along with David's words, clearly impressed by his willingness to focus on solutions rather than punishment. The young man in the wrinkled suit was taking notes, probably planning to tell this story to his coworkers for months. Judge Wilson smiled slightly, the first time she had shown any emotion other than stern authority during the entire proceedings. Director Thompson, your approach to this situation demonstrates exactly the kind of leadership our law enforcement community needs. She turned to address the entire courtroom. Let this case serve as a reminder to all of us that assumptions can be dangerous, that every person deserves respect, and that the truth will always come to light in the end. As the court session ended and people began to file out, Officer Johnson approached David hesitantly. His partner Rodriguez hung back, still too embarrassed to face the FBI director directly. Director Thompson, Johnson said quietly, I owe you an apology. My behavior was unprofessional and my assumptions were wrong. I hope you can forgive me. David extended his hand for a handshake. Officer Johnson, we all make mistakes. What matters is how we learn from them and do better going forward. I hope this experience helps you become an even better officer. The handshake was brief but genuine. Johnson walked away knowing he had a lot of work to do to rebuild his reputation and his self-respect, but also knowing that he had been given a second chance by someone who had every right to make his life very difficult. As David gathered his papers and prepared to leave the courthouse, the bailiff approached him with a smile. Director Thompson, in 30 years of working in courts, I've never seen anything quite like that. You handled yourself with real class. David nodded gratefully. Thank you. Justice isn't just about punishment. Sometimes it's about teaching and learning and growing together. Walking out of the courthouse into the bright morning sunlight, David reflected on how a simple traffic stop had turned into something much bigger. He knew that the story of what happened in that courtroom would spread throughout the law enforcement community, and hopefully, it would serve as a reminder that every interaction with the public is an opportunity to build trust or tear it down. Their real victory wasn't getting the charges dismissed. The real victory was the possibility that other officers might think twice before making assumptions, and other citizens might be treated with the respect and dignity they deserve, regardless of who they are or what they look like. Rebecca Palmer felt victorious as she walked back up the hill toward Willowbrook Estates. In her mind, she had just defended her community from an unwelcome intruder. The security guard had arrived, taken one look at David's boat, and simply asked a few questions before leaving. Rebecca assumed this meant the problem was solved, not realizing the guard had actually been impressed by David's calm professionalism and proper documentation. By Sunday evening, Rebecca had already called an emergency HOA meeting. She sent out emails with the subject line, "Urgent, our lake under threat," and posted dramatic messages on the community Facebook page. Her description of events painted David as an aggressive trespasser who had invaded their private sanctuary and threatened their peaceful way of life. The Willowbrook Estates Fishing Club was particularly upset. This group of 15 wealthy residents had been using the lake every weekend for over a decade. They considered it their personal retreat, a place where they could escape the stress of their high-powered jobs and enjoy some male bonding time away from their families. Club President Tom Bradley was furious. "This is exactly what I was afraid would happen," he told the group gathered in his man cave. "You give these people an inch and they take a mile. Pretty soon we'll have all sorts of undesirable elements thinking they can just waltz in here and use our facilities." The other members nodded in agreement. These were successful businessmen, lawyers, and doctors who were used to getting their way. The thought of losing their weekend fishing spot to someone they considered beneath them was unacceptable. Rebecca fed off their anger. "I've already contacted our attorney," she announced at the emergency meeting held in the community center. "We need to establish our legal rights to that lake once and for all. Our property values depend on maintaining the exclusive nature of our community." What Rebecca didn't know was that David had been quietly doing his own research. While she was organizing her crusade, He was sitting in his home office reviewing every document related to the lake purchase. His attorney had been thorough, ensuring that the property transfer was completely legal and properly recorded with the county. David discovered something interesting in the old property records. The lake and surrounding land had never actually belonged to the Willowbrook Estates development. The previous owner, Mr. Henderson, had been a kind but somewhat absent-minded elderly gentleman who had simply ignored the neighbors' unauthorized use of his property for years. The fishing club members had apparently assumed that because no one stopped them, they had some sort of legal right to be there. In reality, they had been trespassing for over 15 years, and the only reason they hadn't been prosecuted was Mr. Henderson's generous nature. Meanwhile, Rebecca was making phone calls to everyone she could think of. She contacted the county sheriff's office demanding they investigate the suspicious individual who was harassing their community. She called the local newspaper, hoping to generate public support for their cause. She even reached out to other HOA presidents in nearby neighborhoods, warning them about property invaders who might target their communities next. David's first clue about the extent of Rebecca's campaign came when Deputy Rodriguez knocked on his cabin door on Tuesday afternoon. The young officer looked somewhat embarrassed as he explained the reason for his visit. "Sir, we've received several complaints about possible trespassing at this location," Deputy Rodriguez said professionally. "I'm required to investigate, but I have to tell you, the complainants seem to have some of their facts wrong." David invited the deputy inside and calmly produced his property deed, purchase agreement, and title insurance policy. Deputy Rodriguez examined the documents carefully, his expression growing more puzzled by the minute. "Mr. Johnson, these documents clearly show you own this entire property, including the lake. The people who filed the complaint claim they have community rights to use the water, but I don't see any easements or shared access agreements in these papers." "That's because there aren't any," David explained. "I purchased this property from the Henderson estate 3 months ago. Everything was handled through proper legal channels." Deputy Rodriguez shook his head in amazement. "Sir, I have to ask, are you aware that there's a fishing club that's been using your lake for years?" "I am now," David replied with a slight smile. "I've seen them out there on weekends. I assumed they had permission from the previous owner." "Well, according to these documents, any permission they might have had died with Mr. Henderson. They're technically trespassing every time they set foot on your property." After the deputy left, David sat on his porch overlooking the lake, processing this new information. He had bought this property as a peaceful retreat, not looking for conflict with anyone. But Rebecca's aggressive behavior and public campaign against him was forcing his hand. That evening, David's phone started ringing. Word had somehow gotten out that the deputy had visited his property, and local residents were curious about what was happening. Some callers were polite, genuinely trying to understand the situation. Others were hostile, clearly influenced by Rebecca's version of events. One caller, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen who lived on the other side of the lake, surprised him with her honesty. "Mr. Johnson, I've been watching this whole thing unfold, and I want you to know that not everyone in this community agrees with Rebecca Palmer's behavior. Some of us remember when families like yours weren't welcome in neighborhoods like this, and we don't want to see history repeat itself." Her words hit David harder than he expected. He had worked his entire career to prove himself in rooms where he was often the only person who looked like him. He had earned his success through dedication, intelligence, and perseverance. The idea that his achievements could be dismissed simply because of assumptions about who he was supposed to be was both familiar and frustrating. By Wednesday, Rebecca's campaign was in full swing. She had organized a petition demanding action from local authorities. She had scheduled meetings with county commissioners. She had even contacted a local news station, hoping to generate media coverage of what she called a property rights crisis. The fishing club members were contributing to a legal fund, convinced they were fighting for their constitutional rights. They hired their own attorney, an expensive lawyer who specialized in property disputes and had a reputation for aggressive tactics. What none of them realized was that their legal position was completely indefensible. They had no documentation, supporting their claimed rights to the lake. They had no easements, no written agreements, no legal standing whatsoever. They were about to spend thousands of dollars fighting a battle they had already lost. David, meanwhile, was documenting everything. Every phone call, every Facebook post, every public statement Rebecca made was being carefully recorded. His own attorney had advised him to build a complete record of the harassment campaign, just in case legal action became necessary. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on David. Here were people who claimed to represent law and order, property, rights, and community values. Yet they were engaged in a systematic campaign to deny him the peaceful enjoyment of property he had legally purchased. Their behavior revealed more about their character than they probably intended. As the week progressed, David made a decision. He had initially hoped to coexist peacefully with his neighbors, perhaps even allowing the fishing club to continue, using the lake under proper agreements. But Rebecca's aggressive campaign and the personal attacks he was enduring had changed his perspective. It was time for the truth to come out, and David had a feeling that when it did, the conversation was going to be very different than what Rebecca Palmer was expecting. The confrontation that would change everything happened on a Thursday morning. David was sitting on his dock, enjoying his coffee and watching the sunrise paint the lake in shades of gold and orange. He had been expecting this moment for days, ever since Deputy Rodriguez's visit had apparently stirred up even more drama in the Willowbrook Estates community. Rebecca Palmer came marching down the hill like a woman on a mission, but this time she wasn't alone. Behind her walked a burly security guard wearing an official-looking uniform and carrying a clipboard. Tom Bradley from the fishing club was there too, along with 3 other club members who looked ready for a fight. They also brought along Jennifer Walsh, a local real estate agent who apparently specialized in property protection services. David set down his coffee cup and stood up slowly, his movements calm and deliberate. He had been preparing for this moment, and tucked safely in his jacket pocket was a manila envelope containing copies of all his property documents. "There he is," Rebecca announced loudly, pointing at David as if he were a wanted criminal. "That's the man who's been trespassing on our community property and refusing to leave despite multiple warnings." The security guard, whose name tag read Officer Martinez, looked around the pristine lakefront property with obvious confusion. This wasn't what he had been expecting based on Rebecca's dramatic phone call. The property was well maintained, the dock was in excellent condition, and everything looked perfectly legal and legitimate. "Sir," Officer Martinez said professionally, approaching David with measured steps, "I'm responding to reports of unauthorized use of private property. Can you explain your presence here?" David smiled politely. "Of course, officer, I'd be happy to explain everything. But first, may I ask who filed this report and what specific authority they claim over this property?" Rebecca stepped forward immediately. "I filed the report as president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. This lake has been part of our community for over 15 years. We have established rights here, and this man is violating those rights." "Established rights," David repeated thoughtfully. "That's interesting. Officer Martinez, before we go any further, would you like to see the actual legal documentation for this property?" The security guard nodded, grateful for someone who seemed willing to cooperate rather than argue. "That would be very helpful, sir." David reached into his jacket and pulled out the manila envelope. As he opened it and began extracting documents, Rebecca's confident expression started to waver slightly. Tom Bradley stepped closer, trying to see what papers David was holding. "Here's the property deed," David said calmly, handing the first document to Officer Martinez. "This shows the legal ownership of the entire 50-acre parcel, including the lake and all surrounding land." Officer Martinez examined the deed carefully, his eyebrows rising as he read the details. "Mr. Johnson, this document shows you as the sole owner of this entire property, purchased 3 months ago from the Henderson estate." "That's correct," David confirmed. "And here's the title insurance policy, the survey maps, and the purchase agreement. Everything was handled through proper legal channels and recorded with the county clerk's office." Rebecca's face was turning pale, but she wasn't ready to give up yet. "That's impossible. We've been using this lake for years. Mr. Henderson never said anything about selling the property. There must be some kind of mistake. Tom Bradley snatched one of the documents from Officer Martinez's hands, studying it desperately. This has to be fake. Nobody told us anything about a sale. We have a fishing club here. We've invested thousands of dollars in equipment and boat storage. I understand your surprise, David said gently. But the sale was completely legal and public record. The Henderson estate was required to sell the property to settle debts and distribute assets to heirs. I purchased it through a legitimate real estate transaction. Jennifer Walsh, the real estate agent, was frantically typing on her phone, apparently, trying to verify the information through property records. After a few minutes, her expression changed from skepticism to shock. The records confirm it, she announced quietly. David Johnson purchased this property from the Henderson estate 3 months ago for $1.2 million. The transaction is legitimate and properly recorded. The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The fishing club members stood frozen, the reality of their situation slowly sinking in. Officer Martinez handed the documents back to David with obvious respect. Mr. Johnson, these documents clearly establish your ownership of this property. I'm curious, though, have you been aware that these people have been using your lake? I have, David replied. I noticed the fishing club members on weekends, and I've seen Mrs. Palmer and others around the property several times. Initially, I assumed they had some sort of arrangement with the previous owner. We did, Tom Bradley insisted desperately. Mr. Henderson was fine with us being here. He never complained or asked us to leave. David nodded understandingly. I'm sure Mr. Henderson was a kind man who didn't want to cause conflict. However, his personal tolerance of your presence doesn't create any legal rights for you to continue using the property under new ownership. Rebecca finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a croak. But what about our community? What about our property values? We built our whole neighborhood around access to this lake. Ma'am, Officer Martinez interjected. With all due respect, your community's assumptions about lake access don't override legal property ownership. If your HOA wanted guaranteed access to this water, you should have secured proper easements or access rights during your development process. The fishing club members were whispering among themselves, the reality of their situation becoming clear. They had been trespassing for 15 years, and now they had not only lost their fishing spot but potentially faced legal consequences for their unauthorized use. Jennifer Walsh stepped forward, trying to salvage something from the disaster. Mr. Johnson, surely we can work out some kind of arrangement. These people have been using this lake for years. There must be some way to continue the relationship. David considered this for a moment, his expression thoughtful. 3 months ago, he might have been open to such an arrangement. He had purchased this property for peace and solitude, not to create conflict with neighbors. But then he thought about Rebecca's aggressive confrontations, her public campaign against him, the threatening phone calls, and the assumptions people had made about who he was and whether he belonged in their community. I appreciate the suggestion, David said, carefully. But given the events of the past week, including public accusations, harassment, and attempts to have me removed from my own property, I think it's best if I exercise my full legal rights as the property owner. Officer Martinez nodded approvingly. That's certainly your right, sir. And frankly, after what I've heard about this situation, I think you're being quite reasonable. Rebecca's shock was transforming into anger. This isn't over. We'll fight this. We'll get lawyers. We'll go to the county commissioners. There has to be something we can do. You're absolutely free to consult with attorneys, David replied calmly. But I think you'll find that property law is quite clear on this matter. I own this land and I have the right to determine who uses it and under what circumstances. Tom Bradley kicked at the gravel in frustration. 15 years. We've been coming here for 15 years. We've got thousands of dollars invested in this place. I understand your disappointment, David said sincerely. But your investment was in someone else's property without their explicit permission. That was always a risk. As the group began to disperse, Officer Martinez approached David privately. Sir, I have to say you've handled this situation with remarkable patience. A lot of people wouldn't have been as professional after the kind of treatment you've received. David smiled. Officer, I've learned that the best response to prejudice and assumptions is simply the truth. Today, the truth spoke for itself. As Rebecca and her group walked back up the hill, their heads hanging in defeat, David returned to his dock and picked up his coffee cup. The lake was peaceful again, just as it should be. The days following the big revelation were anything but peaceful for David Johnson. He had hoped that once the truth came out, everyone would simply accept the situation and move on. But Rebecca Palmer had other plans, and her reaction to being proven wrong was far worse than her original behavior. Instead of apologizing or quietly backing down, Rebecca doubled down on her crusade. She seemed to take the humiliation personally, as if David had somehow tricked her, rather than simply owning property that she had incorrectly assumed belonged to her community. The first sign of escalation came on Friday morning when David discovered flyers posted around the neighborhood. Rebecca had apparently spent the night creating and distributing a document titled "Protect Your Property Values" that painted David as a threatening outsider who was destroying the character of their community. The flyers were carefully worded to avoid direct lies, but they painted a picture that was completely misleading. Rebecca described David as someone who had invaded their peaceful lakeside community and was using aggressive legal tactics to steal community resources that families had relied on for years. David's neighbor across the lake, Mrs. Chen, called him that evening to warn him about what was happening. "Mr. Johnson, I think you should know that Rebecca is organizing some kind of meeting at the community center tomorrow. She's telling people that you're planning to fence off the entire lake and put up no trespassing signs everywhere." "I haven't made any such plans," David replied, though Rebecca's behavior was certainly pushing him in that direction. "I figured as much," Mrs. Chen said. "But she's got people worked up. Some folks are talking about forming a neighborhood watch to monitor suspicious activity around the lake. I'm afraid this might get out of hand." Mrs. Chen was right to be concerned. By Saturday afternoon, Rebecca had organized what she called a community protection rally in the Willowbrook Estates Community Center. Nearly 50 residents showed up, most of them fired up by Rebecca's dramatic descriptions of the threat to their way of life. Tom Bradley and the fishing club members were there in force, sharing stories about their 15-year investment in the lake and how David was stealing their retirement dreams. They had apparently convinced themselves that their years of unauthorized use had somehow created legal rights that David was violating. But Rebecca's campaign went beyond just the lake issue. She began making phone calls to David's business clients, claiming that he was involved in questionable property dealings and suggesting that his environmental consulting firm couldn't be trusted. She contacted the Better Business Bureau with vague complaints about his business practices. David's assistant called him on Monday morning with disturbing news. "Mr. Johnson, I've had 3 clients call this morning asking about some kind of property dispute you're involved in. Someone has been contacting them with concerns about your character and reliability." David felt his patience finally beginning to wear thin. Attacking him personally was one thing, but going after his livelihood crossed a line that he wasn't willing to ignore. "Get me Attorney Wilson on the phone," David told his assistant. "It's time to take this situation seriously." Attorney Patricia Wilson had been David's lawyer for 5 years, handling everything from business contracts to the lake property purchase. She listened carefully as David explained the escalating harassment campaign. "David, what you're describing sounds like a clear case of defamation and possibly harassment," she said. "This woman is making false statements about you to damage your reputation and business. That's actionable under state law." Meanwhile, the Willowbrook Estates Fishing Club was falling apart from the inside. The 15 members had each contributed money to hire an expensive attorney, convinced they could somehow fight David's legal ownership of the lake. But when their lawyer reviewed the situation, he delivered devastating news. "Gentlemen, I've reviewed all the documents and researched the legal precedents," Attorney Harrison told the group during an emergency meeting at Tom Bradley's house. "You have absolutely no legal standing to challenge Mr. Johnson's ownership of this property. Furthermore, your 15 years of unauthorized use actually makes you vulnerable to trespassing charges. The room erupted in angry voices. But we've been going there for years, shouted club member Robert Green. Doesn't that count for anything? It counts as 15 years of trespassing, Attorney Harrison replied bluntly. The legal concept you're thinking of is called adverse possession, but it requires specific conditions that clearly haven't been met here. You never claimed ownership, you never paid taxes on the property, and you never had exclusive use of the land. Tom Bradley was furious. So you're telling me we paid you $3,000 to tell us we don't have a case? I'm telling you the truth about your legal position, the attorney replied. And frankly, if Mr. Johnson decides to pursue legal action against you for trespassing, you could be facing significant financial consequences. The fishing club members began turning on each other. Some blamed Tom for convincing them they had legal rights. Others blamed Rebecca for stirring up trouble that should have been handled quietly. A few members started talking about suing Rebecca for the legal fees they had wasted. David, meanwhile, was documenting everything. Every flyer, every phone call to his business, every false statement Rebecca made was being carefully recorded. His attorney was building a comprehensive case that would demonstrate a clear pattern of harassment and defamation. The breaking point came when Rebecca organized a protest outside David's environmental consulting office. She gathered about a dozen supporters and spent an afternoon with signs claiming David was stealing community property and destroying neighborhood values. David's employees were upset and confused. His clients started asking questions. His business reputation, which he had spent years building, was being damaged by someone who had been proven completely wrong about the basic facts of the situation. That evening, David made a decision that would change everything. He called attorney Wilson and gave her the go-ahead to take legal action. Patricia, I want you to file for a restraining order against Rebecca Palmer. I also want to pursue defamation charges for the false statements she's made about my business. And I want to send cease and desist letters to every member of that fishing club, formally notifying them that they are no longer welcome on my property. I think that's the right decision, David, his attorney replied. This woman has escalated far beyond reasonable behavior, and you have every right to protect yourself and your business. But David wasn't finished. The harassment campaign had opened. His eyes to just how far some people would go to avoid accepting reality. Rebecca's behavior had revealed something ugly about the community he had hoped to join peacefully. Patricia, I also want you to research what legal options I have regarding the years of unauthorized use of my property. If these people want to play hardball, they should understand that game works both ways. As David hung up the phone, he looked out his window at the lake that had caused so much drama. He had bought this property for peace and solitude, but Rebecca Palmer's behavior had turned it into a battleground. Now it was time to fight back, and David had the law on his side. The fishing club members were about to learn that their 15 years of unauthorized use came with consequences. Rebecca was about to discover that attacking someone's livelihood had serious legal ramifications, and the Willowbrook Estates community was about to see what happened when assumptions and prejudice collided with property law and justice. The reckoning was just beginning, and David Johnson was no longer interested in being the patient victim of other people's ignorance and entitlement. 6 months later, David Johnson sat on his dock watching the sunrise over his lake, sipping coffee from his favorite mug. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the orange and pink clouds like a mirror. For the first time since he had bought this property, he felt truly peaceful. The legal storm that had consumed the past half year was finally over, and justice had been served in ways that even David hadn't expected. The consequences for Rebecca Palmer and the Willowbrook Estates Fishing Club had been swift and decisive. The restraining order against Rebecca had been granted within 2 weeks of filing. Judge Martinez had reviewed the evidence of her harassment campaign, including recordings of threatening phone calls, copies of the defamatory flyers, and testimony from David's business clients who had been contacted with false information. Mrs. Palmer, Judge Martinez had said during the hearing, your behavior represents a clear pattern of harassment directed at Mr. Johnson simply because he exercised his legal property rights. This court finds your actions to be both unreasonable and unlawful. Rebecca had tried to defend herself, claiming she was just protecting her community, but the judge wasn't buying it. The restraining order prohibited her from coming within 500 feet of David or his property, and from making any further contact with his business associates. But the restraining order was just the beginning. David's defamation lawsuit had been even more devastating for Rebecca. Her false statements about his business practices had caused 3 major clients to cancel contracts, resulting in over $80,000 in lost revenue that could be directly traced to her campaign. The jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding Rebecca liable for defamation and awarding David $150,000 in damages, plus attorney fees. Even more damaging to Rebecca personally, the Real Estate Commission had opened an investigation into her conduct after learning about the harassment campaign. Your actions reflect poorly on the integrity of our profession, the commission chair had written in a letter suspending Rebecca's real estate license for 6 months. Professionals in our field are expected to resolve disputes through proper legal channels, not through public harassment campaigns. The fishing club had faced its own reckoning. After Attorney Wilson sent cease and desist letters to all 15 members, most had simply accepted the situation and found other places to fish. But 5 members, led by Tom Bradley, had decided to fight back by filing a frivolous lawsuit claiming adverse possession rights to the lake. That decision had backfired spectacularly. Not only had their lawsuit been dismissed with prejudice, but David had filed a countersuit for 15 years of trespassing. Under state law, property owners could seek damages for unauthorized use of their land, and David's calculations were eye-opening. Your Honor, Attorney Wilson had presented to the court, the defendants used Mr. Johnson's property approximately 50 weekends per year for 15 years. Based on comparable lake access fees in this area, the fair market value of that unauthorized use totals $47,000 plus interest. The 5 fishing club members had been ordered to pay David $12,000 each, money they could have avoided losing if they had simply accepted reality and found a new fishing spot. But the most dramatic consequence came when the other 10 fishing club members learned about the lawsuit. Furious at Tom Bradley for dragging them into an expensive legal battle they couldn't win, they filed their own lawsuit against him for misrepresenting their legal position and wasting their money. The Willowbrook Estates Fishing Club, which had existed for 15 years, dissolved completely within 3 months. Tom Bradley, facing legal bills exceeding $25,000, had been forced to sell his expensive boat and fishing equipment to pay his debts. The Willowbrook Estates HOA had also undergone major changes. Embarrassed by Rebecca's behavior and facing potential liability for her actions while serving as HOA president, the community had voted her out of office and elected new leadership committed to respectful neighbor relations. The new HOA president, Dr. Amanda Foster, had personally visited David to apologize for the community's behavior. Mr. Johnson, what happened to you was unacceptable, and it doesn't represent the values that most of us try to live by. We hope you'll give us a chance to be better neighbors. David had appreciated her sincerity, and over time, he had developed positive relationships with several Willowbrook Estates residents who had remained neutral during the conflict or actively supported him. Mrs. Chen had become a good friend, often joining David for morning coffee on his dock. You know, she told him one day, this whole situation taught our community some important lessons about making assumptions and treating people with respect. The financial settlements had allowed David to make significant improvements to his property. He had installed a beautiful walking trail around the lake, complete with benches and native plant gardens. He had also built a small pavilion where he occasionally hosted environmental education programs for local school groups. The irony wasn't lost on David that his property had become more beautiful and better maintained than it had ever been during the years when the fishing club was using it. His background in environmental consulting had helped him develop conservation practices that improved the lake's water quality and attracted more wildlife. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was what David had done with part of his legal settlement money. He had established a scholarship fund for underprivileged students pursuing careers in environmental science, and he regularly hosted summer programs that brought diverse groups of young people to learn about lake ecology and conservation. On this particular morning, David could see a group of teenagers from the inner city getting ready for their weekly nature program. These young people, who looked like him and came from backgrounds similar to his own, were learning about water quality testing and wildlife management on the very lake where he had once been told he didn't belong. David's phone buzzed with a text message from his attorney. "Rebecca Palmer filed for bankruptcy yesterday. Thought you should know the final chapter of this saga." David read the message and felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. He had never wanted to destroy anyone's life, but Rebecca's choices had led to consequences that extended far beyond their original dispute. Her real estate career was over, her legal bills had consumed her savings, and her reputation in the community was permanently damaged. The fishing club members who had been reasonable had found new places to enjoy their hobby and had learned valuable lessons about respecting property rights. Some had even thanked David for handling the situation professionally despite their initial hostility. As David watched his young environmental students laughing and learning on the dock, he reflected on how the whole experience had changed him. He had bought this property seeking peace and solitude, but what he had found was a calling to use his resources and position to make a positive difference in the world. The lake that had been the source of so much conflict had become a symbol of something much more important: the power of patience, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the possibility of turning negative experiences into positive outcomes. Rebecca Palmer's attempt to drive him away based on her assumptions and prejudices had backfired completely. Instead of losing his property, David had gained legal validation, financial compensation, and most importantly, a sense of purpose that extended far beyond his personal enjoyment of the lake. As the sun fully rose over the water, David raised his coffee mug in a silent toast to justice served and lessons learned. Sometimes the best revenge was simply living well and using your success to help others achieve their own dreams. The lake was finally at peace, and so was David Johnson.